crucifixion. This was used by the Romans for hundreds of years, mostly on slaves, foreigners, and anyone who went against the state. The brutal part of crucifixion is that the victim's own body killed them. The victim was usually beaten and whipped first, then forced to carry the wooden crossbeam to the execution site. Their arms were stretched out and nailed to the beam through the wrists. The nails would often hit a major nerve, causing constant burning pain down the arms. The feet were nailed to the bottom of an upright post. Once the cross was raised, the victim's body would hang in a way that made it almost impossible to breathe. The only way to take a breath was to push up on the nails in their feet. As the hours went on, the muscles would give out, and pushing up became harder and harder. Eventually, the victim couldn't push up at all, and they slowly suffocated. Death could take anywhere from a few hours to several days. If the executioners wanted to speed things up, they would break the victim's legs. The body was usually left on the cross afterward for birds and animals. After the slave revolt led by Spartacus was crushed in 71 BCE, around 6,000 captured slaves were crucified along the road from Capua to Rome. When a Roman slave owner named Pedanius Secundus was killed by one of his slaves, all 400 of his slaves were crucified, including women and children. In 1968, a heel bone with a crucifixion nail still in it was found in a tomb in Jerusalem. It was banned in the 4th century after Rome converted to Christianity. Rat torture. From the medieval period all the way into the 1970s, rats were used to torture prisoners across Europe and South America, mostly to get information out of them. The most common version involved placing a rat on the victim's bare stomach and covering it with a metal bowl or bucket. The bowl was then heated from the outside with a torch or hot coals. As the metal got hotter, the rat would panic and try to escape. The only way out was down, so it would start clawing and chewing through the victim's flesh, digging into the stomach to get away from the heat. Once inside the body, the rat kept going, tearing through whatever was in its way until it found a way out. A Dutch military leader named Diederik Sonoy was known for using this on prisoners during the 80 Years' War in the 16th century. In medieval Germany, there was a version where a metal cage full of starving rats was locked around the victim's head. The rats would eat the victim's face while they were still alive. In the Tower of London, there was a cell called the Rat Dungeon. When the River Thames rose, the water would push hundreds of rats into the cell where prisoners were chained up. The rats would chew on them for days. The worst version showed up during Argentina's Dirty War from 1976 to 1983. Death squads working under a military dictatorship used a tube to force live rats inside prisoners through their backside. Around 30,000 people went missing during this period, and many were tortured this way before being killed. Hanged, drawn, and quartered. For almost 600 years, this was the official punishment for high treason in England. It was only used on men. Women convicted of the same crime were burned at the stake instead, because showing a woman's body during the quartering was seen as improper. The victim was first tied to a wooden board and dragged through the streets behind a horse. Crowds would line the road to throw things at them. Once they reached the execution site, the victim was hanged by the neck, but not until dead. They were cut down while still conscious, then castrated, and their stomach was cut open. The intestines and organs were pulled out and burned right in front of them while they were still alive. After that, the victim was beheaded, and the body was chopped into 4 pieces. The head was usually stuck on a spike on London Bridge, and the 4 parts were sent to different cities. The Scottish rebel William Wallace was executed this way in 1305. His arms and legs were sent to Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth. Guy Fawkes was sentenced to the same thing in 1606 after trying to blow up Parliament. He had already been broken on the rack so badly that he couldn't even sign his own name. When they brought him to the gallows, he managed to jump from the platform hard enough to break his own neck and skip the rest of it. They still quartered his dead body. The last person to get the full punishment was David Tyree in 1782. Around 100,000 people showed up to watch. Impalement. The brutal part of impalement is that the victim tortured themselves. It was used in Assyria, the Ottoman Empire, and parts of Eastern Europe, mostly on traitors, rebels, and prisoners of war. A wooden stake was sharpened at the tip and driven into the victim's body from below. In the most common version, the stake was pushed in just deep enough to hold the person in place, but not deep enough to hit anything vital. The stake was then raised upright, so the victim was sitting on it high off the ground. As long as the victim stayed up on their toes, they could keep the stake from going any deeper. But as soon as their legs got tired and they slipped, the stake would push further in. The pain would make them scramble back up on muscles that were already exhausted, only to slip again a little later, and again, each time a little further down, until something vital was finally hit. It could take hours or even days. In another version, the stake was driven all the way through the body, entering from below and coming out through the chest, shoulder, or mouth. The victim was then planted upright along a road for everyone to see. In the 15th century, Vlad III of Wallachia used this so often he became known as Vlad the Impaler. After one battle against the Ottoman army, the road leading to his city was lined with around 23,000 impaled bodies. The Ottomans had their own version called the Sengula, where an iron meat hook was forced under the victim's ribs, and they were left hanging from it until they died. Blood eagle. The Vikings reserved this for the most hated enemies, usually rival kings or men who killed a family member. It was a ritual execution from around the 8th to 11th century in Scandinavia, believed to be a sacrifice to Odin, the god of war and death. The victim was laid face down. The executioner would take a sharp knife or axe and cut along both sides of the spine. The ribs were then pulled outward from the back, one by one, and spread apart so they stuck out like wings. Once the ribs were open, the lungs were pulled out through the back and draped over the bones. In some accounts, salt was poured into the open wounds. The stories say the victim was alive through the whole thing. There are 9 known accounts of this happening. In one, a Viking leader named Einar did it to a man named Halfdan after a power struggle on the Orkney Islands off the coast of Scotland. In another, the Viking warrior Ivar the Boneless captured King Aella of Northumbria in England after Aella had thrown his father into a pit full of snakes. Ivar had the blood eagle carved into his back. Nobody knows if it actually happened. Some believe the stories came from old Viking poems about leaving dead enemies on battlefields for eagles to eat, and that later, writers turned that image into a real punishment. In 2022, researchers built body models and tested whether it could be done with the tools Vikings had. It could, but the victim would have been dead long before the wings were finished. Sawing in half. Ancient Persia, Rome, the Ottoman Empire, and parts of Europe all used this, mostly on traitors and prisoners of war. One of the first recorded cases was ordered by the half-sister of the Persian king, Darius II. The victim's ankles were tied to 2 poles, or hung from a frame with their legs spread apart. They were hung upside down so blood would rush to the head and keep them awake as long as possible. 2 executioners would then place a large 2-man saw between the legs and start cutting downward from the groin. As the saw cut through the pelvis, the stomach, and the intestines, blood and everything inside would spill down onto the victim's face. The victim's hands were sometimes left free, so they could reach toward the wound but couldn't stop it. How fast the executioners worked was up to them, and if they wanted to drag it out, they could stop and start again. Victims could survive all the way until the saw reached the chest. Death came once it hit the heart or lungs. In some places, the victim was laid flat and sawed across the middle instead of top to bottom. This was quicker, but the upside-down version was considered worse because it kept the victim alive so much longer. The Roman Emperor Caligula was known for having people sawed in half while he ate his meals. In the 1450s, the Ottoman Sultan Muhammad the Conqueror promised 500 Christian prisoners that their lives would be spared, then had every one of them sawed in 2. As late as 1848, during the Hungarian Revolution, women and children were killed this way. The breaking wheel. Also known as the Catherine wheel, this was one of the most common execution methods in medieval Europe, used mostly for murder and treason. The victim was tied down on the ground or on a wooden board. The executioner would then take a heavy iron bar and start smashing the victim's bones, one by one. It usually started with the legs, then the arms, and worked its way toward the chest and spine. How bad it got depended on the crime. For the worst criminals, the executioner started from the bottom, hitting the shins first so the victim would stay awake for as long as possible. For lesser crimes, a killing blow to the neck or chest could be given early on, which was considered a mercy. Once the bones were broken, the victim's body was bent and woven through the spokes of a large wooden wagon wheel. The wheel was then raised up on a tall pole for everyone to see, and the victim was left there. Some died within hours from shock and blood loss. Others lasted much longer, slowly dying from their wounds while birds and animals picked at their body. There's one recorded case of a man surviving 9 days on the wheel before he finally died. The last known use was in Prussia in 1841. A German executioner named Franz Schmidt did this job for 45 years and killed 361 people. He said the breaking wheel was the worst punishment he ever had to carry out. In one case, he had to break a man's bones with 31 strikes after burning him with red-hot metal clamps. Flaying. This meant removing the skin from a living person. It was used in Assyria, Persia, China, and parts of Europe, usually on rebels, traitors, or corrupt officials. Skin doesn't have major blood vessels, so the victim wouldn't bleed out. They stayed awake through most of it. The victim was usually tied down or hung up so they couldn't move. In some cases, the body was boiled or left out in the sun beforehand to loosen the skin and make it easier to peel off. The executioner would then start cutting and pulling the skin away from the flesh, usually starting with the face, which was the most painful part because of how many nerves are packed into it. From there, the executioner worked down the rest of the body. Once the skin was gone, the exposed flesh was so raw that even air touching it caused pain. And because the body can't keep itself warm without skin, death usually came hours or even days later from shock, infection, or the cold. In China, a version of this involved burying the victim up to the neck. A cross-shaped cut was made at the top of the head, the skin peeled back, and mercury poured into the wound. The weight of the mercury would pull the skin away from the flesh, so as the victim struggled to get out, they would leave their skin behind in the hole. An Assyrian king named Ashurnasirpal II bragged about covering pillars with the skins of rebels. A Persian judge named Sasamnes was flayed alive for taking bribes, and his skin was used to cover the chair the next judge had to sit in. Lingchi. Also known as death by 1,000 cuts, this was a Chinese execution method used for treason and killing family members. Because the Chinese believed a body needed to be whole after death to have a peaceful afterlife, this punishment destroyed the body and the soul. The victim was tied to a wooden frame in a public space. An executioner would then start slicing off pieces of flesh, starting with the arms and chest, then moving down to the legs. The cuts were deep enough to cause serious pain, but not deep enough to let the victim bleed out, so they stayed awake through most of it. This went on for hours, sometimes longer. If the victim was lucky, their family could pay off the executioner to end it early. If not, the cutting continued until most of the flesh was gone, the arms were cut off, and then the head. There were different variations. In one, the executioner would pull a random knife from a pile, each one with a body part written on it. Whatever came up, that's where the next cut was made. This kept going until he pulled the one that said heart, and that's when the victim was finally killed. In another version, a fishnet was tied tightly around the body, and the bits of skin that pushed through the holes were sliced off. A Ming general named Yuan Chonghuan was executed this way in 1630 after being accused of betrayal. The public hated him so much that people in the crowd bought pieces of his flesh as they were cut off and ate them. The last case happened in 1905. There are photographs of it. Scaphism. Most punishments were designed to kill. This one was designed to keep the victim alive. The victim was stripped and tied down between two boats, one on top of the other, with holes cut out so the head, arms, and legs stuck out. They were then force-fed large amounts of milk and honey until their stomach was full. The same mixture was rubbed all over their skin, especially the eyes, ears, nose, mouth, and private parts. The boats were then pushed out onto a still lake under the hot sun. Within hours, flies, wasps, beetles, and whatever else lived nearby would start covering the victim's face and body, biting and digging into the flesh, crawling into the eyes, ears, and nose. Because the victim was tied down, they couldn't do anything about it. The force feeding would also cause severe diarrhea, and because the victim was trapped inside the boats, the filth just built up around them, breeding maggots and worms that started eating into the body from below. Rats would also try to get inside the victim through any opening they could find. Every morning, the boat was brought back to shore, the victim force-fed again, covered in honey again, and pushed back out. This went on for days or even weeks, the body swelling from infection, the flesh splitting and rotting while the victim was still alive. A soldier named Mithridates was given this punishment after getting drunk and bragging about killing a prince when he'd been told to keep quiet about it. He lasted 17 days. If you'd like to see more stories like this, make sure to subscribe and feel free to drop suggestions for the next video in the comments.